In the spring of 1929, in the deserts of southern Iraq, a crew of workers lowered themselves into a pit that was already deeper than most men would ever dig in a lifetime. They had been on this site for years. They had pulled gold helmets, silver harps, and the bones of an entire royal court out of the sand. And then, near the bottom of that pit, their tools stopped biting into rubble and started sliding through something different. Clean mud, smooth water-laid silt, packed solid with no broken pottery in it, no bricks, no bones, just sediment, the kind of sediment a river leaves behind after a flood drains away. They kept digging through it anyway, 1 foot, 3 feet, 8 feet, and then, underneath all of that mud, they hit something that should not have been there. Another city, older, buried, sealed away beneath the silt like a chapter somebody had quietly torn out of a book and hoped no one would notice was missing. The man in charge of that dig sent a short message back to London. "We have found the flood. This is the story of what Leonard Woolley pulled out of the ground beneath the ancient city of Ur in 1929. It is the story of an 8-foot layer of mud, a forgotten civilization underneath it, and a discovery that was loudly announced to the world and then, just as quietly, explained away." And the closer you look at how that explanation was built, the more you wonder what exactly we were being talked out of. If buried history is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, the kind of story where the official version has gaps you could drive a truck through, then do me one favour before we go any further. Subscribe right now. This channel lives for exactly this. The cities buried under other cities. The layers of mud nobody wants to explain. The history that got paved over and handed back to us with the hard parts removed. Hit that subscribe button and let's climb back down into the pit together. To understand why this discovery mattered, you have to understand who Leonard Woolley was. The easiest way to make a story like this disappear is to attach it to a crank, a dreamer, somebody nobody has to take seriously. Woolley was none of those things. He was not a fringe figure, not a treasure hunter chasing a legend with a shovel and a hunch. He was one of the most respected archaeologists of his generation, leading a major joint expedition funded by two of the most powerful institutions in the field, the British Museum in London and the University of Pennsylvania. When Woolley made a claim, museums listened, newspapers printed it. Other scholars argued with him as an equal. This was the establishment, and in the 1920s the establishment's most spectacular dig site was Ur, an ancient Sumerian city sitting in the desert of what is now southern Iraq. If the name rings a faint bell, it should. This is the Ur of the Chaldees, the city named in the book of Genesis as the birthplace of Abraham. Woolley and his teams have been working there since 1922, and what came out of that ground did not just add a few footnotes to history. It forced people to rewrite entire chapters of it. They uncovered the royal cemetery of Ur, and the word breathtaking does not really cover it. Tomb after tomb packed with gold, silver, and deep blue lapis lazuli. The burial of Queen Puabi, found with an elaborate headdress of gold leaves, ribbons, and beads, still arranged exactly as it had been placed on her thousands of years before. The Standard of Ur, a panel inlaid with tiny figures showing a vanished kingdom at war and at peace. And then there was the discovery that still unsettles people who read about it today. Woolley called it the Great Death Pit. It was a mass grave, and inside it lay the bodies of dozens of people. Not random victims, attendants, soldiers in their gear, musicians with their instruments, servants of the court dressed in their finest clothing and jewellery, laid out in careful, orderly rows. An entire royal household that appears to have followed its rulers down into the earth. These people were arranged, not dumped. It was ceremony. And it tells you that the people of Ur took death, and what lay beneath the ground, extremely seriously. So by 1929, Woolley had already made the kind of discovery most archaeologists only dream about. He could have stopped there and let the gold speak for itself. But a different question was gnawing at him. He did not just want to know about the people in the cemetery. He wanted to know what was underneath them. He wanted to know how deep the human story at Ur ran, how far down you could dig before the layers of civilization gave out and there was nothing left but empty soil. So he gave the order. dig a deep, narrow shaft straight down through the cemetery, through everything below it, and do not stop until there is nothing left to find. That is when his workers hit the mud. It stopped them cold because it was nothing like the layers above it. This was a thick, clean band of water-laid silt. In places it ran around 8 feet deep, and in some accounts even more. But the depth was not the strangest part. The strangest part was how empty it was. Archaeologists read a dig site by its garbage. Every layer of a human settlement is jammed with the debris of daily life, broken pots, crumbled mud brick, ash from old fires, animal bones, the endless mess that people leave behind simply by existing. That is how, people lived there. But this band of silt had almost none of that. It was sterile, clean. It was the unmistakable fingerprint of water, and nothing but water. Woolley knew exactly what a layer like that was telling him. Clean silt does not quietly appear in the middle of a thriving city. A thick deposit of river mud sitting directly on top of a settlement means one thing, and it is not subtle. Water came, an enormous amount of it, and it arrived fast enough and stood long enough to bury an entire living city under sediment. His wife, Catherine Woolley, was there at the dig with him. The story that comes down to us is that Woolley had the trench wall cleaned and cut straight so the layers could be read like the page of a book, and the two of them stood there and read it. Above, the rubbish of a city, then 8 feet of flood. He did not waver. He was convinced he was standing in front of physical, undeniable proof of the Great Flood itself, the deluge from the book of Genesis, the same catastrophe recorded in a far older form in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. And that older form is worth pausing on. Long before Genesis was ever written, the people of this exact region were already telling the story. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, a man named Utnapishtim is warned that the gods intend to drown the world. He builds a great boat, loads it with his family and with living creatures, and rides out floodwaters that cover everything. When the rain stops, he releases birds to search for dry land. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is Noah, written down centuries before anyone wrote down Noah. Same flood, same boat, same handful of survivors clinging on while a world is erased beneath them. Woolley believed his 8 feet of silt was the real event behind both stories. But here is the detail that turned a dramatic flood into a lasting mystery. Below the silt, the picture did not go dark. Woolley's team kept digging beneath the mud, and under all of it they found it again. Human occupation, pottery, tools, the walls and floors of houses, an entire earlier settlement, an older world sealed completely beneath the flood layer. Sit with what that means. The flood at did not just damage a city and move on. It split the human timeline clean in two. There was a world before the mud, and there was a separate world after it. And the people who came afterward were, in the most literal sense, rebuilding their civilization directly on top of an older one that had been wiped off the face of the earth. For a while, the whole world ran with it, the man who found Noah's flood. That is a headline that circles the globe, and then slowly and steadily came the walk back. Other archaeologists spread out across Mesopotamia and sank their own deep pits, at Kish, at a site called Shurapak, at Uruk, and they found flood layers too, silt, water damage, the clear marks of serious flooding in the ancient past. You might think that is powerful confirmation, more flood layers, more proof, but it was not treated that way, because when the experts lined up the evidence, those flood deposits sat at different depths and dated to different centuries. Had its flood, Kish had a different flood, Shurapak had another one again, not a single shared catastrophe, several separate ones, so the official conclusion was written down, and it has barely been touched since. There was no single universal flood. Mesopotamia, the experts explained, is a huge flat floodplain squeezed between two unpredictable rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Flooding there is ordinary, practically the weather. And so Woolley's Great Flood was quietly reclassified. It was demoted. It became a large but strictly local event, a bad season for one city, important to her and nothing more. And on paper, that explanation is reasonable enough. Rivers flood. Floodplains, by definition, flood. Fair enough. But this is the point where the official story starts to feel just a little too smooth. Look closely at what that reinterpretation actually accomplishes. It takes a discovery that was first announced to the world as proof of a civilization-ending catastrophe, and it shrinks it, calmly and professionally, down into a weather report. It turns the sentence "we have found the flood" into the sentence "we have found a flood." One word swapped out, and that single word quietly controls exactly how seriously you are ever allowed to take any of it again. Look at the raw facts that survive no matter which interpretation you choose. An 8-foot layer of clean silt is not a puddle. That is a staggering volume of sediment, enough to bury houses, streets, walls, an entire inhabited city, and press it all flat. And directly underneath it, a sealed-off earlier civilization that mainstream history is content to label a footnote and walk straight past. Now sit with that shape for a moment. A forgotten settlement, buried suddenly under a smooth and uniform layer of mud, and then a new culture rising up on top of it, building again as if from nothing, only half remembering what came before. Because that shape, that precise sequence of events, is exactly what alternative researchers point at when they talk about a mud flood, a reset, a layer of sediment laid down across the land that draws a hard physical line between an older world and the one we have been firmly told is the first one. The same researchers point to old buildings whose lowest windows and doorways sit half swallowed below today's ground level, and they ask one simple question: what filled all of that in? It is the same instinct that draws people to the story of Tartaria itself, the idea that a whole world can be buried, renamed, and quietly written out of the record. You do not have to accept every part of that framework to notice something uncomfortable. Because Woolley, working for the British Museum in 1929, found that exact line, not in a theory, not in a forum thread. He found it physically, in the ground, with his own hands. To be fair, mainstream archaeology has a confident answer for every piece of this. They will tell you the differing flood dates prove these were separate, unrelated local events. They will tell you the buried settlement under Ur is simply the Ubaid period, thoroughly documented, well understood, nothing hidden and nothing strange about it. And it is entirely possible they are right, but notice the questions that somehow never make it into the polished documentary. If these flood layers scattered across one connected region were all unrelated accidents of weather, then why do so many of the oldest written stories on the planet, told by cultures that had never met, describe the very same event, a flood that wipes the slate clean, a small handful of survivors, a new world rebuilt on top of a drowned one? The Sumerians wrote it down, the Babylonians wrote it down, the authors of Genesis wrote it down, and peoples on the far side of the planet, separated by entire oceans with no possible contact, told their own versions of the same flood. We are always told those are simply myths, just old stories that frightened people invented to explain a frightening world, and maybe many of them are. But Leonard Woolley did not dig up a story. He dug up 8 solid feet of physical sediment and a real abandoned city underneath it. And here is the thought the tidy official version would rather you did not sit with for too long. Ur is one pit, in one city, in one country. It was excavated almost 100 years ago with the tools and the technology of the 1920s, and even that single, narrow, limited dig found an entire buried world hiding under a flood layer. So the obvious question almost asks itself: how much of human history is sitting right now underneath sediment that nobody has ever dug through? How many of the cities we confidently call the first cities are actually the second city built on that spot, or the third, raised on the buried bones of something older that the mud quietly erased from the record? Leonard Woolley died in 1960. He never fully let go of what he believed he had seen in the wall of that trench. The pit at Ur was eventually filled back in. The silt layer is still down there, exactly where he left it. The earlier city is still down there too, sealed, patient, waiting, and the official line has not shifted a single inch in almost a century. A local flood, nothing to see here. Move along. But the longer you look at what Leonard Woolley pulled out of the ground in 1929, the harder it becomes to shake one simple fact. He went down into that pit searching for the bottom of history, the point where the human story runs out and there is nothing left below. And what he found instead was a door, a clean, flat 8-foot wall of mud with an entire forgotten civilization waiting quietly on the other side of it. They told the world it was only a flood. The one man who was actually standing down in that pit, reading the layers with his own eyes, was never quite convinced. And maybe that is the part worth carrying home with you. Maybe it should make us look a little harder at every other place where someone has decided, a little too comfortably, that we already know the whole story.